The dust had not yet settled on the road out of Caldwell, Kansas, when Amos Weston first saw her, and something in the way her shoulders shook stopped him cold in a way that no gunfight, no stampede, and no drought-cracked earth ever had. It was the summer of 1878, late July, when the prairie burned gold and the sky sat so wide and blue above the flat Kansas land that a man could feel both free and terribly small at once. Caldwell was a cattle town, one of the last before the Indian Territory line, and it hummed with the particular noise of a place where money moved fast and men moved faster. Drovers came up from Texas with their longhorns and their short tempers. Merchants stacked their storefronts high with goods. Saloons stayed lit until the sun came back around. It was the kind of town that chewed up the soft-hearted and spit them out before breakfast. Amos had been riding through for 3 days already. He was not from Caldwell. He was not from anywhere in particular anymore, which was a fact he had made his peace with somewhere back around the Oklahoma Panhandle. He was 28 years old, broad through the shoulders, lean through the waist, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the particular shade of gray that made people unsure whether he was angry or just thinking hard. He wore a cavalry-issued coat he had never returned after his discharge, a hat that had survived more weather than most men, and a Colt revolver on his hip that he drew slowly and shot straight. He had a horse named Fletcher, a sorrel gelding with a white blaze, who was easily the most reliable companion Amos had kept in the last several years. He had no particular destination. He was thinking about heading up toward Colorado, maybe. He had heard there was work near Pueblo. He had heard a lot of things about a lot of places, and most of what he heard turned out to be either exaggerated or outright false. But it gave a man something to ride toward, and that was worth something. He had spent his last night in Caldwell, settled his account at the boarding house, nodded to the liveryman, and turned Fletcher north toward the edge of town. He passed the last general store, the last water trough, the last fence post that marked where civilization in Caldwell officially gave up and let the prairie take over. And that was where he saw her. She was standing at the very edge of the road, just off the packed dirt and into the grass, with a carpetbag set down beside her feet. She was not pacing. She was not waving for help. She was simply standing there crying, and she was doing it the way people cry when they have been crying for a long time and have stopped caring who sees it. Her hands were loose at her sides. Her chin was not dipped in shame. She just stood there with tears moving down her face and her eyes fixed on some middle distance that had nothing in it but open prairie and wind. She was young, maybe 24 or 25, with dark auburn hair that had come partly loose from its pins and was blowing sideways in the dry summer wind. She wore a green dress that had seen better days but was kept clean and mended with care. She was not plain. She was, in fact, the kind of woman whose face made a man aware of his own heartbeat in a way that was slightly inconvenient when he was supposed to be riding north toward Colorado. Amos rode past. He told himself later that it was none of his business. He told himself that women cried for all manner of reasons, most of them private, and that riding up to a stranger in distress was liable to embarrass her more than help her. He told himself Fletcher needed water in Wichita and time was wasting. He told himself all of these things and kept his eyes forward and let Fletcher carry him another 50 yards up the road. Then he stopped. He sat there on Fletcher for a long moment, not moving, while the horse shifted his weight and twitched an ear at a fly. The prairie wind came across flat and steady. Behind him he could hear nothing because there was nothing to hear. No wagon, no other riders, just the wind and the grass and whatever silence had settled around that woman at the edge of town. He could not explain it. He had seen plenty of people in hard situations on the road and ridden on. The West was full of hard situations. A man who stopped for every one of them would never get anywhere and would probably get himself shot in the process. He had rules about this. He had kept those rules for years. He turned Fletcher around. He rode back slowly, not wanting to startle her, and when he was about 20 feet away he pulled up and touched the brim of his hat. She had heard the hoofbeats and turned to look at him. Her eyes were red. There was a streak of dust on her left cheek that had mixed with the tears. She looked at him with an expression that was not helpless. It was the expression of someone who had been managing something very heavy entirely alone, and was not sure whether a stranger's arrival made that better or worse. "Ma'am," he said, "sorry to intrude. I was riding past and He stopped because he genuinely did not know how to finish the sentence. He had turned around. He was here. He could not explain why. "Are you all right?" She wiped her face with the back of her hand in one practical swipe. "I have been better," she said. Her voice was steady, which surprised him. It was a clear voice, unhurried, with a faint trace of something southern in it. Georgia, maybe, or Tennessee. "Is there something I can do?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment, assessing, the way a sensible woman alone in the West had to assess every stranger. He sat still and let her look. He had nothing to hide. He was just a man on a horse with no particular plan. "Do you know where the stage comes through?" she asked finally. "Southbound stage runs through town Tuesday and Friday mornings," he said. "Today's Thursday." She closed her eyes briefly. Then she opened them and looked out at the prairie again. "I see. Is there somewhere you are trying to get to?" he asked. She picked up her carpetbag and set it down again as though weighing it. "There was a man in town," she said quietly. "I came up from Wichita on the stage 3 days ago. There was a situation that made it necessary for me to leave Wichita. I had a letter from a man named Hollis, who said he ran a respectable boarding house here in Caldwell and had work available for a woman who could cook and manage a household." She paused. "He did not run a boarding house." Amos understood immediately and felt a cold disgust settle in his chest. "What did he run?" "A saloon," she said flatly, "with rooms above it. I understood the implication when I arrived. I left." She met his eyes directly. "I have been standing here trying to decide which direction to walk." "Where is Hollis now?" Amos asked. His voice had gone very quiet. "Still in his saloon, I expect," she said. "I did not make a scene. There was no point." He studied her a moment. She had a quiet kind of courage about her that he had not expected, given the tears. The tears, he was beginning to understand, were not weakness. They were just the honest overflow of a situation that had been genuinely awful, and she had let them run their course the same way a person lets a storm run its course, without apology and without theatrics. "My name is Amos Weston," he said. "I am riding north. I have no particular plan and no particular hurry. If you need to get somewhere safe, I can help you get there." She studied him again, longer this time. "That is a very generous offer from someone whose name I did not know 30 seconds ago." "It is," he agreed simply. Something in the directness of it seemed to decide her. "Sadie Lockhart," she said. "And I would be grateful for an escort as far as the next town if you are willing." "There is a town called Ashford," he said, 22 miles, has a proper hotel, a legitimate boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Ellers, who I have been told does not run anything other than a boarding house. You could get your bearings there." 22 miles, she repeated and looked at the sky, calculating the hours of daylight left. "I will not make that today," he said. "But I know a good stopping place about 10 miles out. Creek with good water, sheltered by cottonwoods. We can make Ashford by midday tomorrow." She looked at him once more. The assessment was thorough and serious, and he respected it. "All right, Mr. Weston," she said. "I accept." He swung down from Fletcher and offered to put her carpetbag across the saddle. She handed it over without argument, which told him she was practical. He helped her mount, which involved her sitting side saddle in the green dress while he walked alongside leading Fletcher, and they headed north out of Caldwell without looking back at the town that had not been good to either of them. They did not talk much in the first hour. The prairie held them both in its enormous quiet, and the afternoon sun slanted toward the west, and the grass moved in long waves, and Fletcher walked at an easy pace that required no urging. Amos watched the land and watched the road and was aware, with a peripheral attention he could not entirely explain, of the woman sitting on his horse. She broke the silence somewhere around the 4th mile. "What takes you north?" she asked. "Heard there might be work near Pueblo," he said. "What kind of work?" "Ranch work mostly. Maybe some scouting if I can find a surveying outfit. I have done both." He paused. "What took you west from Tennessee?" he guessed. She turned her head to look at him, surprised. "Georgia," she said. "Close." A ghost of something crossed her face that might have been the beginning of a smile. "My parents died 2 years ago, both of them within 6 months of each other. I had a brother in Wichita who said there was opportunity out here." She was quiet for a moment. The opportunity turned out to be that he needed someone to cook and clean for him and his wife, who did not like me, and a series of increasingly aggressive attempts by his wife's brother to court me in a manner I did not find agreeable. So I left, and came to Caldwell. She confirmed, with a dryness in her voice that had no self-pity in it, only a clear-eyed accounting of a run of bad luck. "Where are you trying to get to?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Somewhere I am wanted," she said simply. "Not needed, which is a different thing entirely. Wanted, where I can do honest work and be treated with some basic dignity." She paused. "I am not asking for very much, I think." "No," he said quietly. "You are not." They made the creek stop just as the sun was going down, the sky turning that enormous bruised orange that the flat Kansas sky did better than any painted canvas Amos had ever seen in any city. He helped Sadie down from Fletcher, and she walked on her own straight to the creek, and knelt down and splashed her face and cupped water and drank, and then sat back on her heels and looked at the reflection of the orange sky in the water. He unsaddled Fletcher and let him drink and graze on the creek grass, and built a small fire because the evenings cooled quickly in Kansas, even in July. He had dried beef and hardtack in his saddlebag and a small tin of coffee, and Sadie had 2 apples and a block of cheese she had apparently acquired before leaving Caldwell, which she offered without hesitation, and they divided it all into 2 equal shares with the practicality of people who had both been hungry before and saw no reason for ceremony about a meal. "You were in the cavalry," she said, looking at his coat. "4 years," he said. "Discharged in '75. Where were you posted?" "Kansas mostly. Some time on the Red River. I was here when this territory was still wide open, and I was here when the cattle drive started coming through, and I have been here ever since, more or less." He looked at the fire. "The Army had things I did not like about it and things I was glad of. I was glad of the discipline and the purpose. I was not glad of a good number of specific orders I was given." She looked at him over the fire. "What orders?" He met her eyes. "Ones that I followed because I was a soldier and did not yet understand what it meant to follow an order that was unjust," he said quietly. "I understand it better now." She held his gaze for a moment, and he could see that she understood what he meant without him having to say it plainly. The wars against the Comanche and the Kiowa and the Cheyenne had been fought across this very ground, and the injustice of it was not a secret to anyone who had been there. It had not been glory. It had been something much uglier, and the land still knew it even if the newspapers back east had already turned it into legend. "I am sorry for that," she said. "So am I," he said. "It does not undo it, but it is the truth." They were quiet for a while, the fire small and steady between them. The coyotes started up somewhere to the west, their long, wavering calls moving across the dark. Fletcher stamped once and went back to grazing. The cottonwoods shifted overhead with a sound like water. "What was your life like?" she asked. "Before the Army?" "Ohio," he said. "Farm family, 6 children, I was the 3rd. Father was a decent man who worked himself to death by 53. Mother remarried a man who was not decent. I left at 17. He looked at the fire. "No big story, just a quiet accumulation of reasons." She nodded. There was something in the way she listened that was different from the way most people listened. Most people listened while they were thinking about what they were going to say next. Sadie Lockhart listened as though what you were saying was the only thing in the world at that moment. "What was Georgia like?" he asked. Her face changed. Something softened and then almost immediately steadied itself again. "Beautiful," she said. "Hot and green and slow in a way that this country is absolutely not. We had peaches. The whole county smelled like peaches in August. She looked into the fire. I miss it every single day, but there is nothing there for me now. The house sold. The farm sold. My brother took what there was to take and headed west, and I followed because I did not know what else to do. She paused. That was a mistake. Coming west was not the mistake. Following my brother was the mistake. There is a difference. Yes, there is, he agreed. She looked up at him. You are easy to talk to, Mr. Weston. I did not expect that. What did you expect? Silence, she said, or questions that were actually just opinions wearing question marks. He laughed, short and genuine, and it surprised him slightly because he had not laughed much lately. She smiled when he laughed, and the smile changed her whole face. It was a wide, open smile that was entirely unguarded, and it hit him somewhere in the center of his chest with a force that was completely out of proportion to a smile. He looked back at the fire. They slept on opposite sides of it, each on their own bedroll, which in his case was his saddle blanket doubled over, and in her case was a thin wool blanket she had in the carpetbag. The night was warm enough. He woke twice before dawn, once to add wood to the fire, and once for no reason he could identify, some instinct from the army years that still woke him at odd intervals. Both times he looked across the fire at her and found her sleeping quietly, her hair loose now around her face, her hand tucked under her cheek. He stared at the stars and told himself firmly that he had known this woman for approximately 10 hours, and that was not long enough to feel anything in particular, and that he was going to escort her to Ashford and then continue north to Colorado as planned. He slept. In the morning she was up before him, which he had not expected, and she had the fire going again and the coffee tin heating and was sitting with her knees drawn up watching the sun come over the flat edge of the world in a blaze of red and gold. She had repinned her hair. She looked rested. She looked, he thought, like someone who belonged in an open landscape, which was a strange thought about a woman who had grown up among Georgia peach trees. "Good morning," she said. "Morning," he said. He sat up and ran a hand through his hair, and felt approximately as presentable as a man looks who has slept on the ground, which was not very presentable at all. "Coffee is almost ready," she said, and handed him the tin cup as though this were a perfectly ordinary arrangement between two people who had known each other for years instead of hours. He took it and drank, and it was strong and good, and the sun kept rising, and the prairie was still and enormous around them. They broke camp with the easy efficiency of two people who were accustomed to managing on their own, and by the time the sun was fully up they were back on the road. Amos had offered again to let her ride Fletcher, but Sadie refused, and said she was perfectly capable of walking and preferred it. And so they went together on foot with Fletcher trailing behind on a loose lead, and the walking turned out to be better than the riding for conversation, because they were side by side, and the rhythm of it loosened words in a way that sitting on a horse did not. She told him about her mother, who had been a schoolteacher before she married, and who had made Sadie read everything she could get her hands on, which in rural Georgia was not an enormous library, but was enough to give her a fierce and independent inner life. She told him about the first time she had seen a map of the entire country, and had felt a sudden hungry curiosity about the West that her mother had called foolishness and her father had called spirit. She told him about a boy she had nearly married at 20, a farmer's son, and how she had called it off a week before the wedding because she had looked at the life that was waiting for her and felt something close to despair. "What did the town think?" he asked. "The town thought I had lost my mind," she said cheerfully. "Several women did not speak to me for a year. His mother told anyone who would listen that I was damaged goods." She shrugged. "I was 20 years old and I had just made the best decision of my life. I did not care much what the town thought." "Good," he said. She glanced at him sideways. "You think so? A woman who knows her own mind is not a problem," he said. "She is just a woman who knows her own mind." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You are the first man who has ever said that to me without the word 'unfortunately' somewhere in the sentence." He looked at her. She was looking at the road ahead with a small, careful expression that was trying not to become something else. He looked at the road too, and neither of them said anything for a while, but the silence between them had changed quality. It was warmer now, more settled. They reached Ashford at 11 in the morning under a sun that had turned serious about the business of heat. The town was bigger than Caldwell and quieter, which was an interesting combination. It had a proper main street with a hardware store, a post office, a church, a school that was closed for summer, two saloons that were at least separated from the respectable establishments by a full block, and Mrs. Eller's boarding house, which was a white clapboard building with a garden in front that had real flowers in it. Mrs. Eller's was a stout woman of 60 with spectacles and a manner that managed to be both welcoming and businesslike. She had one room available. She looked at Sadie and then looked at Amos and raised one eyebrow. "My companion and I are not," Sadie began. "2 rooms, then," Mrs. Eller said briskly. "I have a second that becomes available today if you can wait until noon. It is smaller but perfectly clean." Amos had not intended to take a room. He had intended to see Sadie safely to the boarding house and then continue north. He stood in Mrs. Eller's front parlor with its horsehair sofa and its framed Bible verses on the wall and heard himself say, "I will take the smaller room." He could not explain that either. He paid for 2 nights, because it seemed wise to make sure Sadie had time to find her footing before he left, and took Fletcher to the livery stable at the end of town and arranged feed in a stall, and spent 20 minutes brushing the horse down out of a need to do something with his hands while he thought. He was attracted to Sadie Lockhart. This was not a complicated fact. She was beautiful and smart, and had a kind of honest bravery about her that made the world seem simpler when she was nearby. But she had just come out of a genuinely difficult situation. She was in a strange town. She had made it clear that her primary goal was stability and honest work. The last thing she needed was a drifting ex-cavalry man with no settled address taking up space in her attention. He would stay 2 days, make sure she was settled, and then ride for Colorado. This was a completely sensible plan. He found her at noon in the small dining room of the boarding house, sitting across from a woman named Clara Beaumont, who turned out to be a schoolteacher in Ashford and who was apparently the only other boarder at Mrs. Eller's table. Clara was perhaps 30, with a practical face and an open manner, and she had already taken a liking to Sadie in the way that capable women sometimes immediately recognized and liked each other. Amos sat down at the table, and Mrs. Eller's brought in a lunch of cold roasted chicken and potato salad and bread that was fresh enough to still be warm, and the conversation moved easily across the table in the way of people who are all accustomed to making the best of whatever company they find themselves in. Clara asked Amos what his plans were, and he said he was heading north toward Colorado, and Sadie looked at her plate when he said it, just briefly, just a small downward glance that she recovered from immediately. He noticed it. After lunch he walked into town and went to the general store, and then to the post office to send a letter to a man in Pueblo he knew who had offered ranch work 3 months ago and might still need a hand. He wrote the letter standing at the post office counter, and when he was writing it, he realized that he was writing it in a way that was not urgent. He was writing it in a way that left several weeks open. He sealed it and sent it and walked back out into the Ashford sun. The main street of Ashford had a barber shop, and he went in and got a haircut because he needed one, and sat in the barber's chair looking at himself in the mirror and thinking about a woman with auburn hair and a green dress who had been crying at the edge of a road and had no particular place to go. He found out from the barber, whose name was Pete and who had the talker's gift common to all barbers, that there was a family outside of town called the Riders who had recently lost their house cook and were in want of a housekeeper. The Riders were respectable folk, Pete said. Husband ran the grain elevator. Wife taught Sunday school. 3 children, all school age. Big house, clean, and Mrs. Ryder was said to be a fair employer. Amos thanked Pete and walked back to the boarding house and knocked on Sadie's door. She opened it with her hair still half-pinned and a book in her hand, which was a detail he filed away without meaning to. "Mr. Weston," she said, surprised. "I heard something that might be useful," he said. "May I?" She stepped back and he came in and stood near the door because it was a small room and propriety mattered in a boarding house. He told her what Pete the barber had said about the riders. She listened with her full attention as she always did. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "A housekeeper," she said. "It is honest work," he said. "A family setting, not a saloon." He paused. "You do not have to take it. I am just passing along what I heard." "No," she said. "I am grateful. Yes, I would like to call on them." She looked at him. "Would you come with me to introduce me? I know that is an odd request, but it is not odd," he said. "I will come." She smiled, and there it was again, that wide, unguarded smile, and he looked at the floor. They rode out to the Ryder place the following morning, Sadie on Fletcher and Amos walking, because she had announced that she was not walking 3 miles in the Kansas sun in good shoes, and he had agreed without argument. The Ryder farm was a prosperous-looking place with a good barn and a farmhouse that had been added on to twice, and had a deep porch running the length of the front. Mrs. Ryder was a tall woman in her 40s with a no-nonsense manner that Amos immediately respected. She asked Sadie direct questions about her experience, her background, her expectations, and her reasons for coming to Ashford, and Sadie answered every one of them directly and without embellishment or apology. By the end of 20 minutes, Mrs. Ryder had offered her a room in the house, a fair weekly wage, Sundays off, and the use of the family horse for errands. Sadie accepted. On the walk back to town, Sadie insisted on walking because she wanted to think. She was quiet for the first mile. Then she said, "I did not expect things to resolve this quickly." "They have not fully resolved," he said. "You have taken a position. That is a beginning." "Yes," she said, "but it feels like more than that." She glanced at him sideways. "It feels like the first solid ground I have had in 2 years." He looked at her, and she was looking ahead at the road, her chin up, her expression calm and steady, and the morning sun was full on her face, and he thought with absolute clarity, "I do not want to go to Colorado." He pushed the thought aside. He had a letter in the post to a man in Pueblo. He had plans. He had been moving for 3 years, and movement was the only thing he reliably knew how to do. They had dinner that evening at Mrs. Eller's table again, all 4 of them, and Clara told a story about a student who had attempted to bring a live prairie dog to class as a scientific specimen, and the resulting chaos, and Sadie laughed until she had to press her napkin against her mouth, and even Mrs. Ellers allowed herself a dignified chuckle. Amos watched the table and felt something settle in his chest that he was not entirely comfortable with because it felt too much like belonging somewhere. After dinner, Sadie and Clara sat on the front porch in the evening air, and Amos sat on the porch steps with his coffee and listened to the 2 women talk about books. And somewhere in the conversation they drew him in, and he found himself talking about a copy of Charles Dickens he had read during a particularly slow winter posting in Kansas and had not been able to stop thinking about since. Sadie had read the same book. They talked about it until the stars came out and Mrs. Ellers appeared in the doorway to remind everyone that the house had a 10 o'clock door policy. He lay awake that night for a long time. He had planned to leave on Saturday morning. Saturday morning arrived with a thunderstorm, which was Kansas being itself, a rolling dark sky that appeared from nowhere and delivered 2 hours of hard rain and then moved on as though it had never been. He could not leave in the rain sensibly. He would leave Sunday. On Saturday afternoon, with the streets of Ashford washed clean and the air smelling of wet earth and prairie grass, he found Sadie in Mrs. Eller's back garden, where she was picking green beans because Mrs. Ellers had asked if anyone was willing, and Sadie had said yes before anyone else could move. She was working along the row with the same no-fuss competence she brought to everything, dropping beans into an enamel bowl, and she looked up when she heard his step on the garden path. "Come to help or to watch?" she asked. He crouched down at the other end of the row and started picking. "Help," he said. They worked in the afternoon quiet. A yellow cat came and sat at the garden gate and watched them with the grave disapproval unique to cats. Somewhere down the street, a piano was being played badly in one of the saloons. "You are still here," she said after a while. It was not a complaint. It was an observation with something careful in it. "Storm held me up," he said. She glanced at him. "Yesterday's storm, yes." He picked beans for a moment. "Sadie," he said. "Amos," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. He registered it. "I do not know what I am doing," he said honestly. She was quiet, turning a bean in her fingers, looking at it. "What does that mean?" "It means I came up from Caldwell because I had somewhere to be, and now I have been here 4 days and I cannot seem to make myself leave, and I am trying to work out why." She set the bean in the bowl. She looked at him, direct and steady. "I think you know why." "I think so too," he said. "I am trying to decide if it is sensible." "Probably not," she said. "Most of the worthwhile things aren't." He looked at her for a long moment. The cat at the gate made a sound of deep feline disapproval and wandered off. The badly played piano down the street stumbled through something that might have been a hymn. "I would like to call on you properly," he said, "if you are willing." She held his gaze, and he could see that she was genuinely considering it, not as a formality but as a real question she was asking herself. He liked that. He would have been alarmed if she had said yes too quickly. "Yes," she said after a moment that was just long enough. "I am willing," he exhaled. He had not realized he had been holding his breath. She picked up the enamel bowl and stood and brushed the garden dirt from her skirt. "But I am starting at the Ryder house on Monday," she said, "so you will have to work around that." "I will," he said. He stayed. He did not send a follow-up letter to the man in Pueblo. He went instead to the land office in Ashford and asked about available land in the county. He went to the grain elevator and introduced himself to Mr. Ryder, who was a solid, deliberate man who said he had heard Amos might be looking for work and offered him a temporary post helping with the late summer grain harvest, which would last through August and into September and paid fair wages. Amos accepted. The work was good. It was hard physical work in the way that harvest work always is, up before dawn and into the fields and back at sunset, with the kind of bone tiredness that makes a man sleep clean and deep and wake ready to do it again. Amos had a room above the livery stable which was not elegant but was his own, and Fletcher was well kept in the stall below. And on Sunday mornings he put on his cleanest clothes and walked out to the Ryder farm and called on Sadie. Their courtship had a quality that he had not experienced before. They talked. They talked the way people talk when they have both been lonely for a long time and have found someone who makes the world make a kind of sense. They walked along the creek that ran behind the Ryder property. They sat on the fence rails in the evening and watched the sun go down. They argued once about whether the reconstruction had been abandoned too soon, and the argument was fierce and well-reasoned on both sides, and ended with neither of them having changed their position, but both of them feeling oddly elated. The way you feel when someone takes you seriously enough to disagree with you properly. He found out more about her, piece by piece, in the way you learn a person gradually. He learned that she was afraid of nothing that he could identify except spiders, which she dealt with by setting a glass over them and sliding a piece of paper underneath and releasing them outside. He learned that she hummed when she was content and went very quiet when she was upset. He learned that she kept a small leather-bound journal that she wrote in every evening and that she had kept one since she was 13. He learned that she could bake a pie that made grown men go silent with appreciation, and that she knew this and was modest about it while being entirely aware of it. She learned about him too. She learned that he carried a photograph of his mother in his coat pocket, a small daguerreotype worn smooth at the edges. She learned that he woke early and would sometimes sit outside in the dark before dawn just to have the quiet. She learned that he had a gentleness with animals and children that he did not quite extend to adults, not from hardness, but from a certain respectfulness of what adults were capable of. She learned that he was honest to a degree that was sometimes startling, that he would say true things plainly when other men would cushion them, or simply not say them at all. He told him on one of those Sunday afternoons on the creek fence in early September that she had been afraid of him at first, not of him personally but of what she had felt when he turned his horse around. "I had just decided," she said, "that I was going to stop relying on anyone, that I was going to figure out where I was going entirely on my own terms. And then you turned around." She looked at the water. "I was almost angry about it." "Almost," he said. "Almost," she confirmed. He turned to look at her profile in the September light. The cottonwoods along the creek had started to go yellow. The air had the first cool edge of autumn in it. She was wearing a gray dress today instead of the green one, and her hair was properly pinned, and she looked settled and purposeful and at home in her own life in a way she had not when he had first seen her, and it did something complicated to his chest to notice that. "Sadie," he said. She turned and looked at him, and whatever was in his face must have told her something because she went very still. "I need to tell you something," he said, "before this goes any further." "Tell me," she said. He looked at the creek. "I have been moving for 6 years. I am not entirely sure I know how to stop. I have tried before twice, and both times something made me get back on my horse and ride." He paused. "I do not want to make you a promise and then become someone who cannot keep it. You have had enough of men who are something other than what they say they are. I will not be another one." She was quiet for a moment. "What are you telling me?" she said carefully. "Are you telling me you are going to leave?" "No," he said. "I am telling you that I am afraid I might want to, someday, and I want you to know it before you decide anything." She looked at him for a long moment, and her expression was complicated and honest and entirely undisguised. "I appreciate that," she said. "Now may I tell you something? Please." "I am afraid too," she said. "I am afraid of building something and having it taken. I am afraid of trusting a man with the important parts of myself and having him decide they are too much or too strange or too inconvenient. I am afraid of Georgia and Ohio and Wichita and Caldwell, of all the places that turned out to be something other than what they promised." She held his gaze. "But I am also tired of being afraid. And you, Amos Weston, are the first man I have ever met who told me his fear before I had to discover it." He held her gaze. "I think," he said slowly, "that might be the most important thing anyone has ever said to me." She reached out and put her hand on the fence rail next to his, not taking his hand. Just close, an inch of weathered fence rail between their fingers. He moved his hand the inch. She let him. They stayed there by the creek until the sun was fully gone and the first stars appeared and the autumn air got cold enough that she shivered once, and he took off his cavalry coat and put it around her shoulders without asking, and she pulled it closer around herself without protesting, and neither of them said anything about it. October came. The harvest ended, and Amos's wages from the Ryder grain operation gave him enough to begin seriously thinking about land. He had spent his evenings through September in the land office reading records and looking at maps and talking to the county agent, a tired, helpful man named Wilson, about what was available and what was workable in the region. There was a piece of land 4 miles east of Ashford that had caught his eye. 160 acres, a fair portion of it good grassland, a creek running along the northern edge, and a small timber stand. Under the Homestead Act, he could claim it for a filing fee of $18 and the commitment to improve it within 5 years. It was not the biggest piece of land in the county. It was not the finest. But it was solid ground on good terrain, and he had looked at it twice on horseback, and each time he had felt something in him settle and say, "Here." He had not said anything to Sadie about it yet because he was not in the habit of talking about plans before he was certain of them, and he was not entirely certain of this one until the morning in mid-October when he went to the land office and filed the claim. He rode out to the Ryder farm on Sunday with a folded document in his inside coat pocket. She was in the kitchen garden when he arrived, turning the last of the season's soil for winter, and she was wearing her work dress and her hair was loosely tied back and she had a streak of good dark soil on her forearm. Mrs. Ryder, who had developed a warm regard for Amos over the months, came to the door and said she would send Sadie out, and retreated diplomatically into the house. Sadie came out and saw his expression and said, "What has happened?" "Nothing bad," he said. She looked at him more carefully. "What has happened that is not bad?" He took the document from his pocket and held it out to her. She unfolded it and read it, and her face changed while she was reading it. She read it twice, then she looked up at him. "You filed a homestead claim," she said. "4 miles east," he said. "Good grassland, creek along the north edge, a timber stand." He paused. "There is nothing on it yet. It will take time and work to make it into something." She was holding the document with both hands, looking at him. "Amos, I know I should have asked you before I did it," he said. "I did not want to ask you and then not do it. I wanted to do it and then ask you." He took a breath. "Sadie, I have been in love with you since approximately the 4th mile outside Caldwell. I was not going to say it until I had something solid to say it with. I have now." Her eyes were bright. She was pressing her lips together in a way that he had come to recognize meant she was keeping something very large inside herself from getting out all at once. "I am asking you," he said carefully, "if you might want eventually, when you feel it is right, to build something on that land with me." She put her hand over her mouth for a moment. Then she lowered it and looked at him with those clear, bright eyes. "You love me," she said. "Deeply," he said, "in what I expect to be an entirely permanent manner." She made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something else. "I love you," she said, as though the word was a door she had been thinking about opening for months and had now decided to walk through. "I have loved you since you turned that horse around, which is the most inconvenient thing that has ever happened to me." He stepped forward and she stepped forward, and he put his arms around her, and she pressed her face against his chest, and they stood in the October garden of the Ryder farm with the cold, clear sky above them and the smell of turned earth around them. And he held her and she held him, and it felt, he thought, like the first time in his life that stopping somewhere had felt exactly right. They were engaged by Christmas. It was not a dramatic proposal. He asked her one evening in December when they were walking back from the church social that Mrs. Ellers had organized, and the snow had just started to fall, the first real snow of the season, light and steady in the darkness. He stopped walking and she stopped walking, and he said very simply, "I would like to marry you, Sadie, if you will have me." She stood in the falling snow and looked at him and said, "Yes, of course yes. Why have you taken so long to ask?" He laughed and she laughed, and the snow fell around them in the quiet Ashford street, and he kissed her for the first time standing there in the cold, and it was warm and it was right, and it was the beginning of everything that mattered. The wedding was planned for the following spring, April of 1879. There were practical reasons for the timing. The homestead needed work before it was livable, and Amos spent the winter months building it. He was not doing it alone. Amos had met a man named Dale Pruitt at the harvest work, a carpenter from Ohio who had come west with his wife and settled outside Ashford. Dale agreed to help build the house in exchange for a fair wage and the promise of help with his own outbuildings in the spring. They worked through the winter on the days when the weather allowed, and by March there was a proper house standing on the land claim, 2 rooms down and a loft above, a stone fireplace, a deep porch facing south to catch the sun, and a well that Amos and Dale had dug together in November. Sadie went to see it for the first time on a Saturday in late March, with Clara Beaumont and Mrs. Ryder as her company, and Amos waiting at the property line because he had wanted to be there when she first saw it. He watched her face as she took in the house, the porch, the land, the creek line to the north, the wide sky above it all. She walked to the porch and stepped up onto it and turned to face the south view, which on that March day showed the prairie going to early green under a pale sky, and she stood there looking at it with her hand on the porch railing, and then she turned back to him and she was smiling. "It is exactly right," she said. He let out a breath he had been holding for 4 months. The wedding took place on the 12th of April, 1879, in the Ashford church, which was small and wooden, and had 6 windows that let in the spring light in long golden bars across the pine floor. Mrs. Ellers provided the reception at the boarding house. Clara Beaumont stood with Sadie, Dale Prout stood with Amos. Mr. and Mrs. Ryder attended. Pete the barber attended. Perhaps 30 people from the town and the surrounding farms attended, because Ashford was the kind of town where people showed up for things, and a wedding was a reason to show up. Sadie wore a dress the color of cream with blue ribbon trim that Clara had helped her make through the winter. Her auburn hair was up, and she had a small spray of wild prairie flowers tucked into it that she had picked herself from the side of the road on the way to the church. She walked in on her own because there was no father to give her away, and she walked with the same straight-backed, purposeful step that she always walked with. And when she came down the aisle and he saw her face, which was calm and bright and entirely certain, Amos felt something in his chest that he had no adequate word for and had stopped trying to find a word for. The Reverend was a young man, not yet 30, who had come out from Missouri and still looked slightly surprised to find himself in Kansas. But he read the service carefully and with genuine feeling. And when he reached the vows, he looked at Amos, and Amos looked at Sadie and said them as though they were the truest things he had ever said, which they were. She said hers looking straight at him, her voice clear and steady and warm, and she held his hands and he could feel that her hands were trembling slightly, not from fear but from the particular overwhelming quality of a thing you have waited for and are now, finally, receiving. When the Reverend declared them married, the small congregation made a sound of collective satisfaction, the particular warmth of a community that has watched two people find each other and is glad of it. He kissed her, and she kissed him back, and Clara made a small happy sound, and Mrs. Ellers applied her handkerchief with efficiency. They moved into the house on the homestead the following week. The first morning she made coffee in the kitchen she had arranged herself, with the shelves where she had decided shelves should be and the table in the window because she liked morning light, and she brought 2 cups out to the porch where Amos was watching the sunrise, and they stood together in the cool spring morning and drank their coffee and the land spread out before them new and entirely theirs. "Amos," she said. "I am happy," she said. It was simple and complete and offered without any of the wariness that happiness had always carried for her before. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him. "Good," he said. "So am I." The first summer on the homestead was the kind of summer that teaches a person everything they do not already know about farming and ranching in the Kansas plains. Amos ran cattle, 8 head to start, purchased from a neighbor who was cutting his herd. He put in a kitchen garden. He built a small barn. He fixed the fence line that marked the property because the spring floods had taken 2 sections of it. He was up early and to bed late, and the work was in his hands and his back every day, and he did not mind it. He had always needed to be occupied. The difference was that now the occupation was for something that was his. Sadie ran the house with the same quiet competence she brought to everything. She planted a large kitchen garden and kept it producing through the summer. She learned the rhythms of the land with a speed that surprised Amos and probably should not have. She read everything she could find about cattle keeping and prairie farming, and would sometimes bring a question to him at dinner that showed she had been thinking about something all day. A question about soil or water or animal health that was specific and practical, and showed a mind genuinely engaged with the problem. By fall she was riding out with him to check the cattle, which she had started doing partly out of curiosity and partly out of a determination not to be confined to the house when there was a whole working property around her. She rode a steady mare named Blue that Amos had bought from the riders in the spring, and she rode well, which she attributed to a neighbor's horse she had managed to borrow frequently as a child in Georgia. They had their difficulties, as any 2 people do. There was a week in September when they could not agree about money, specifically about whether to take out a small loan to expand the cattle operation, and the argument lasted 3 days and involved long silences and one evening where they both sat on opposite sides of the kitchen and read their separate books with slightly more emphasis than was strictly necessary. On the 4th day, Sadie came to find him in the barn and said, I have been thinking about it more and I believe you are right about the loan, but I want us to agree on the figure before you go to the bank. And that was the end of the argument, because she was always able to do that, come to the resolution directly, without needing the other person to have been entirely wrong. He admired that about her. He tried to emulate it. He was better at it by winter than he had been in spring. October brought rain, and then a brief early cold snap, and then a golden reprieve of warm autumn days that the old-timers called second summer. They rode out to the timber stand on the north edge of the property on one of those golden days, and sat in the shade of the cottonwoods along the creek, and Sadie put her feet in the cold water, and made a sound of pure satisfaction. She had brought the last of the wild plum preserves she had put up in August, and he had brought bread and a knife, and they ate and watched the creek and the yellow leaves falling into it. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask. Are you glad you turned around?" She was looking at the water, not at him, and her voice was light, but he could tell it was not an entirely light question. He looked at her profile, the clean line of it in the October sun, and thought about the road out of Caldwell and the dust, and the woman with the carpetbag standing in the grass with tears on her face, and the 50 yards of riding north that he had done before something beyond his understanding had turned him around. "Every single day," he said, "every hour of every day." She turned to look at him, and her eyes were bright. "Good," she said, "because I am glad you turned around too." "I was quite determined not to be glad, but here I am." She leaned over and kissed him, quick and warm, and then went back to watching the creek, and he sat beside her in the golden afternoon and thought, This is the thing a man should arrange his life to have. The following spring, May of 1880, Sadie told him she was expecting their first child. He was in the barn when she told him, fitting a new shoe on Fletcher, and she came in wearing her work dress and her practical expression and said, "I have something to tell you." And then she told him, watching his face carefully, which he noticed, and he understood that she was watching because it mattered, because this was big, and she wanted to see his real reaction. His real reaction was that he set down the horseshoe and stood up and crossed the barn and took her face in both hands and kissed her once, very deliberately, and then pressed his forehead against hers and could not say anything for a moment because the size of what he was feeling had taken his words. "Well then," she said softly. "Well then," he agreed. The child was born in January of 1881. A boy. Arrived in the middle of a snowstorm that prevented the doctor from coming and required the very capable attendance of Clara Beaumont, who had apparently not disclosed that she had helped with 3 births in her home county in Missouri. The birth was hard and long, and Amos stayed in the kitchen because Clara very firmly put him there, and he sat at the kitchen table and listened to the sounds from the back room, and held his own hands and stared at nothing, and understood for the first time in his life the profound helplessness of loving someone who was in a fight he could not help them with. When Clara came to the kitchen door, her face was tired but calm, and she said, "Come." He came. Sadie was exhausted and white and damp with the effort of it, and she had their son in her arms, and she looked up at Amos when he came in with an expression that was beyond anything he had vocabulary for. She was entirely spent and entirely triumphant, and her eyes were full of something that was not tears, or not only tears, but a kind of radiant certainty. "He is perfect," she said. "Come and see." He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, who was red-faced and new and outraged in the particular way of newborns who have just discovered that the world is cold and bright, and who had a faint dark fuzz of hair and a face that Amos was already trying to map against his own and Sadie's and could find pieces of both. "Hello," Amos said to him, very quietly, because it seemed the right register for meeting someone new. The baby blinked. "What shall we call him?" Sadie asked. They had discussed names but not settled. "Thomas," Amos said. "After my father's first name before his father's. It was the good name, untouched by the man his father had been in the later years." "Thomas," Sadie said, trying it. "Thomas Weston." She looked at the baby. "What do you think?" The baby made a sound that Clara from the doorway declared to be complete agreement. Thomas Weston grew the way children do, fast and surprising, in the way that people describe but that nonetheless manages to astonish every parent who experiences it. By spring of 1882, he was a round, firm, determined creature of 14 months who had opinions about everything and communicated them with authority. The homestead was growing too. Amos had increased the cattle to 30 head by the summer of 1882 and had added 10 acres of corn and a proper root cellar that he and Dale Prout had built over 2 weekends in October. The barn had been expanded. The house had grown a second proper bedroom for Thomas and a larger kitchen that Sadie had planned herself, with the exact shelving she wanted and the window she had always wanted over the work table. They had become, gradually and without noticing the exact moment it happened, people who belonged to their county. They knew their neighbors. They helped with harvest and were helped with theirs. Amos sat on the committee that decided where the new county road would run. Sadie organized the church social every third Sunday and had won the pie competition at the county fair in 1881 and again in 1882, the second win with a wild plum pie that the judge declared unprecedented in his 20 years of pie assessment. Clara Beaumont came to dinner on Sundays. Mrs. Ryder came to tea on Thursdays. Dale Prout and his wife, Ellen, became the kind of friends who could be called on at any hour, which had been tested and proven during Thomas's illness in the winter of 1882, a chest fever that had lasted 2 weeks, and during which Ellen Prout had come and stayed without being asked, and had helped Sadie nurse him through the worst nights. The child recovered fully, but those 2 weeks had marked Amos and Sadie with the particular knowledge that comes from nearly losing what matters most. They were tender with each other in the aftermath, more careful and more grateful, and if they had not been fully aware before of how much they had built together and how much it was worth, they were aware of it after. In the summer of 1883, Sadie told him she was expecting again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, and in March of 1884 she gave birth to a daughter, also in the middle of bad weather because it seemed to be a pattern, with the doctor this time present and the process somewhat less dramatic than Thomas's arrival. They named her Me after Sadie's mother, whose full name was Margaret Me Lockhart and who had been, by all accounts, a woman of spirit and learning. Me Weston arrived in the world with the same auburn hair as her mother and the same gray eyes as her father and a placid good temper that was, her parents privately agreed, a gift from some more patient ancestor. Thomas, who was 3, inspected his new sister with scientific thoroughness and announced that she was acceptable. Clara, who was present, reported this declaration with delight to everyone in Ashford. Life on the homestead in those years had the quality that good daily life sometimes has, not dramatic, not particularly remarkable to an outsider, but deeply satisfying in its texture and its accumulation. The seasons turned. The cattle grew, and the herd was managed, and the hard years were hard, and the good years were generous. Sadie's garden was the most productive in the county, a fact that was not an accident but the result of years of attention and experimentation, and the reading of every piece of agricultural literature she could find. She corresponded, beginning in 1883, with a woman in Wichita who ran an agricultural newsletter for women farmers, and her letters were published twice, which delighted Clara and embarrassed Sadie pleasantly. There were still hard things. The winter of 1885 brought a blizzard that killed 6 of their cattle and destroyed the new section of fence and kept them snowbound for 11 days, which was long enough that they had to ration the food stores, and Amos spent 3 of those days digging out the barn in stages to keep the remaining animals alive. On the 8th day Sadie lit both lamps and read aloud to the children in the evening, and then read aloud to Amos after the children were in bed, which was what she did when the difficulty of something needed to be held steady. She put good words into the air of the room and let them do their quiet work. There were also joyful things. There was the day in 1884 when their neighbor, an elderly man named Harmon who had farmed the land to the west for 20 years alone, knocked on their door during the first autumn storm, and Sadie opened it, and saw that he was ill, and brought him in and nursed him back to health over 2 weeks, and then organized a quiet conversation between Amos and Dale Prout that resulted in Harmon's heaviest work being shared by 3 families for the remainder of his years on his property, which he continued to work until he was 76. He left his land to Thomas Weston in his will when he died in 1887, which added another 140 acres to the property, and which Amos, reading the will in the land office, had to sit with for a long moment before he could speak. There was the evening in the summer of 1886 when Amos came in from the fields at sunset to find Sadie on the porch with her journal open and a glass of water, and she was writing with the focused, unhurried absorption that meant the words were coming well. And he came up the porch steps, and she looked up and smiled at him, the wide, unguarded smile, and he sat down in the other chair, and Fletcher, who was old now but still alive and still occupying his stall with the dignity of an elder statesman, went at once from the direction of the barn, and Thomas came running from the garden with a frog in both hands, wanting his father to look at it immediately, and me was visible through the kitchen window, standing on a chair helping herself to something from the shelf, and the light was the particular Kansas evening light, golden and enormous and clean, and Amos looked at all of it and felt something so large and complete that it had no name. "What are you thinking?" Sadie asked, watching his face. "That if I had ridden straight through," he said, "I would not have any of this." She reached across and put her hand over his. "You did not ride straight through," she said. "No," he said, "I did not." Thomas arrived at his father's knee with the frog still under discussion. Me had acquired a biscuit from somewhere and was eating it with great satisfaction. The prairie darkened slowly toward evening around the house. Fletcher whinnied again, announcing his desire for oats. The stars were beginning, one by one, at the far edge of the sky. "I love you," he said to Sadie. It was not ceremonial, it was just true, the same way the sky above them was true, in a plain and enormous way that required no decoration. She squeezed his hand. "I love you," she said back. The year 1887 was a full year. The Weston property, now considerably expanded by Harmon's bequest, employed 2 young hands through the summer, brothers named Bert and James, who had come north from Texas with the cattle drive and had decided Kansas suited them better than Texas. Amos spent a great deal of the spring planning how to manage the expanded acreage, which involved long evenings at the kitchen table with maps and figures, and Sadie across from him with her own opinions about the planning, which were good opinions, and he had learned not only to hear them but to actively seek them. They added a 3rd bedroom to the house that summer, which was practical because Sadie was expecting their 3rd child, due in December. This time the doctor was booked well in advance. Clara, who could be trusted to show up regardless, was notified. Ellen Prout offered to take Thomas and me for the duration. The child arrived on a clear, cold night in mid-December, a boy again, and he arrived with great speed and very little drama compared to his siblings. He was named James, for no grand reason except that Sadie had always liked the name, and Amos had no objection. James Weston was, from the very beginning, a contented and observant child who seemed to find everything around him genuinely interesting, which Clara said would make him either a scholar or a naturalist, and possibly both. By Christmas of 1887, the Weston household was loud and busy and warm, and full of the particular beautiful chaos of a family that is properly and completely alive. Thomas, who was 7, had acquired his father's seriousness and his mother's directness, and was already the kind of child who asked teachers difficult questions and expected real answers. Me, who was 3, had her grandmother's name, and it was becoming clear, a great deal of her grandmother's reported spirit. James was 3 weeks old and had not yet declared his position on anything, but seemed basically positive about the world. Sadie sat by the fire on Christmas evening after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, and Amos came and sat beside her with his coffee, and they listened to the wind outside and the fire and the particular deep silence of a winter night in a full house where everyone is safe. "Do you remember standing at the edge of town?" she asked quietly. "Caldwell," he said, "the day I went past and turned around." "Yes." He looked at the fire. "I think about it sometimes. I try to understand what made me turn. I still cannot give it a clear reason." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Perhaps it does not need one," she said. "Perhaps some things just turn. Some things just turn toward what they need." He rested his chin on top of her head. The fire crackled. Outside, the Kansas wind moved across the prairie in the old, wide, eternal way that the wind on the prairie always moves, carrying nothing and everything across the flat face of the earth. "I used to be afraid of stopping," he said. "I used to think that stopping was the same as giving up, like a horse that won't go forward." "And now?" she asked. "Now I think stopping is just recognizing where you are," he said. "Where you actually are, not where you were going, not where you had been, just here." She lifted her head and looked at him in the firelight, and he looked back at her. And there in her face was everything he had turned around for: the intelligence and the courage and the honesty and the particular quality of aliveness that she brought to every room she entered, and every mile of road she walked, and every morning she brought coffee out to the porch and said his name in that clear, warm voice. "Here," she said simply. "Here," he agreed. He kissed her, slow and warm, in the way of people who have been kissing each other for years and have never let it become a habit, and the fire burned down and the house was still. And outside, the great Kansas winter dark held the land in its cold and ancient keeping. The years after that moved with the rhythm of a life that has found its shape. The cattle herd grew to over 80 head by 1889, when Kansas was experiencing one of its better years, the rainfall generous and the markets fair. Bert and James, the two Texas brothers, had stayed on as permanent hands and lived in a small bunkhouse that Amos and Dale had built on the east side of the property in 1888. Bert had married a local girl named Agnes in the spring of 1889, and the wedding had been at the Ashford church, and the reception had been at the Weston homestead, because by then the Weston's property was the natural gathering place for the people of that part of the county, the house big enough, the yard wide enough, the welcome reliable. Thomas turned 9 that year and had begun working beside his father in the afternoons after school, with a seriousness that occasionally worried Sadie and delighted Amos, and was, they ultimately agreed, simply who Thomas was. He had his father's attentiveness to the land and his mother's reading habit, and he was already writing letters to agricultural colleges asking questions that the college administrators apparently found interesting enough to answer at length. Me had turned 5 and started school with Clara Beaumont that autumn and had declared school to be her preferred location, which pleased Clara greatly, and which Sadie found both amusing and entirely unsurprising. James was, too, still easy and interested, and had recently developed a passion for Fletcher, the old sorrel horse, who allowed the small boy to pat his nose and bring him apple cores with the resigned tolerance of an animal who has lived long enough to be deeply unimpressed by drama. Fletcher died in the autumn of 1890. He had been 22 years old, which was a good long life for a horse, and he went easily, simply lying down in his stall one morning and not getting up. Amos sat with him for a while before he called for Bert to help. He had ridden that horse across 600 miles of Kansas and Oklahoma, and up and down the cattle trails, and along every road on that homestead for 12 years. Sadie came to find him that evening and found him in the empty stall sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, and she sat down beside him without saying anything and took his hand, and they sat there in the quiet barn with the smell of hay and horses and old wood, and after a while she said, "He was a good horse." "The best I ever had," Amos said. "He took care of you," she said, "and he brought you back to me." She paused. "That is worth a great deal." He looked at her. She was 40 now, or nearly so, and her hair had a thread of silver in the auburn, and there were lines at the corners of her eyes from years of squinting against the Kansas sun. And she was, he thought with a clarity and simplicity that had never diminished, the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "It is worth everything," he said. She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the old sorrel's empty stall, while the autumn dark came down outside, and the land rested around them, and the house lights were warm and visible across the yard where their children were. He bought a new horse in the spring, a gray gelding named River that Thomas immediately claimed a partial ownership of, and the farm work continued, and the seasons turned, and the life they had built held firm against what came against it and flourished in what came for it. And Ashford grew around them, and Kansas grew around Ashford, and the country kept changing, and the prairie kept being itself, enormous and indifferent and beautiful. On the 15th anniversary of the day they had left Caldwell, July of 1893, Sadie suggested they go back, not to stay, not even for a day, just to see it. He looked at her when she suggested it. "We could take the children," she said. "We could drive down. Spend one night and come back." "Why?" he asked. She thought about it for a moment. "Because I want to see it," she said. "I want to see the edge of town where you found me, and I want to see it with all of this behind me." She gestured, meaning the house and the land and the children and the 15 years. "I want to see it and know that I am standing in a completely different place." They drove to Caldwell in the farm wagon, the whole family, Thomas, who was 12 and sat in the front with his father looking grown, me, who was 9 and had brought a book, and James, who was 6 and had brought a small carved horse that he carried everywhere. Sadie sat beside Amos on the wagon bench and watched the Kansas road and the prairie grass and the enormous sky. Caldwell had changed. It was quieter. The great cattle drives had slowed considerably by 1893 as the ranges closed and the ranches consolidated, and the town had the slightly deflated air of a place that had been built for a moment that was passing. But it was still there. The buildings were still there. The main street was still there. Amos drove them to the northern edge of town and stopped the wagon. The road stretched ahead into the open prairie just as it had 15 years ago. The grass moved. The sky was blue and enormous. There was no woman crying at the edge of the road today. There was just the road and the grass and the summer wind. Sadie stood up in the wagon, which made Amos put his hand out to steady her, which she took. She stood and looked at the edge of town for a long moment. "Right there," she said, pointing to the verge of grass beside the road. "I was standing right there." "I know," he said. She looked at it for a long moment. The children were quiet behind them, sensing without understanding that something was happening that was important. "I was so tired," she said quietly. "I had been so tired for so long. I did not know what I was going to do. I was crying because there was nothing else useful to do." "You were not waiting for someone," he said. "You never have been." "No," she said, "but you came anyway." She sat back down beside him, and he was holding her hand still from steadying her, and he did not let go of it, and she did not pull it back. "Can we go now?" Thomas asked from behind them with the pragmatic impatience of a 12-year-old. "In a minute," Amos said. He looked at the edge of town. He thought about the man he had been, riding out of Caldwell that day with no particular plan and no particular place to be. He thought about 50 yards of road and a stopping that he could not explain and a turning around that had changed the entire direction of everything that came after. "Amos," Sadie said beside him. "Thank you for coming back," she said. He turned and looked at her, and she was looking at him with the full steadiness of her regard. And in her eyes was the whole of it, the creek camp and the boarding house and the Ryder farm, and the homestead being built board by board, and Thomas arriving in a snowstorm, and me's first word and James and Fletcher, and the 15 years of mornings and seasons and arguments and reconciliations and dinners and dances and storms and droughts and harvests and everything. All of it there in her eyes, clear and certain. "I could not have done otherwise," he said honestly. "I still cannot explain it," she smiled. "I can," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "Because you are the kind of man," she said, "who cannot ride past a thing that needs attending to, even when you think you can." She paused. "It is perhaps the best thing about you." He laughed and she laughed, and Thomas said very firmly that they had been stopped long enough, and Me said she agreed. And James wanted to know if they could see the saloon because he had heard about saloons, a request that was declined. And Amos clucked to the horse and turned the wagon, and they drove back through Caldwell toward the road north, toward home. They reached the homestead in the late afternoon, the children tumbling out of the wagon with the relief of children who have been sitting still for too long. Thomas immediately heading for the barn, Me immediately heading for the house, James immediately heading for the dog, a large amiable hound named Rufus who had been with the family for 4 years, and who received James with the enthusiasm of someone who had not seen him in weeks rather than a day and a half. Sadie went up the porch steps and turned to look out over the homestead property in the late golden light, the house behind her, the kitchen garden to the side, heavy with late summer produce, the barn at the end of the yard, the fields beyond, the corn standing tall and the pasture green, the creek line in the north with the cottonwoods, golden this late in the summer, the big sky above it turning from blue to the early suggestion of evening gold. Amos came up the steps and stood beside her. "We built something good," she said. "We did," he agreed. She leaned against him, her shoulder against his arm, the easy, comfortable lean of someone who knows exactly where they fit. He put his arm around her. Behind them, inside the house, they could hear Me beginning to set the table, the particular sound of dishes and silverware, and Thomas calling something from the barn, and James telling Rufus something at length about the trip to Caldwell in a tone that suggested the dog was expected to be interested. The evening light came across the land the way evening light comes across the Kansas prairie, slowly and broadly, and with a generosity that takes in everything, the road and the grass and the farmhouse and the people on the porch, and all the small, ordinary, extraordinary life that fills a homestead when people have made something true in a place and chosen to stay in it. Sadie turned her face up to look at him, and he looked down at her, and they were exactly where they were, which was exactly where they needed to be, and there was nothing left to explain and nothing left unfinished, and the life they had begun at the edge of a road in Caldwell, Kansas, in the summer of 1878 was around them now in all its fullness, real and warm and their own. He kissed her. She kissed him back. Rufus barked once, at nothing in particular. James informed the dog that the barking was unnecessary. Thomas came back from the barn with a question about the fence line on the east pasture that he had been thinking about since 2 days ago. Me called from inside that dinner was not going to make itself. Sadie pulled back from the kiss and looked at Amos with the wide, unguarded, entirely undimmed smile, and he looked at her, and the prairie held them in its enormous and ancient peace, and that was how it was.